Let me welcome everyone here to the United States Institute of Peace, and thank you all very much for coming. My name is Sheldon Himmelfarb, believe it or not, and I head USIP's Center of Innovation for Science, Technology, and Peacebuilding that is hosting today's meeting. I'm thrilled we've got such a good crowd here to talk about online discourse in the Arab world, and the first ever comprehensive mapping of the Arabic blogosphere, which, according to our authors here, and I quote their website, utilizes a unique methodology that blends link analysis, term frequency analysis, and human coding. Say what? As moderator, I promise that I will try to minimize the techno jargon throughout the morning here. But I really said that to make an important point, and that is that this is new terrain that we're about to explore with a new vocabulary, and parenthetically I might add this is new terrain to all of us. I took a random sample of both my peers and my 19-year-old daughter's peers about what they thought mapping the Arabic blogosphere meant, and I'm pleased to report that both cohorts were equally clueless. Seriously, though, we are just beginning to try to understand the power of online discourse for conflict management, although it seems like every day we read another breathless news story like the ones we've been hearing today and yesterday about the internet crackdown in Iran, talking about the role of online activity in real conflict situations. But I have to also say we've been hearing these stories for a few years now, whether it was the pseudonymed X-Old Y Mauritanian blogger you guys I'm sure are familiar with, who used some amazing insider information to expose the corruption and power battles in politics there that were leading to a breakdown of the state, whether it was in Kenya, where a group of Kenyan bloggers set up a website called uashidi.com and created this very slick ad hoc verification system to catalog incidents of violence and harassment at the time of the election, and then map those incidents onto a Google Earth map. Or in Pakistan, where bloggers created an online handbook about dealing with protests and arrests called the Emergency Telegraph, and that was teaching people how to deal with these things. Some of you may have heard about Jotman, the anonymous blogger in Southeast Asia. He was an influential voice around the unrest in Burma a few years ago. And of course, many of us in this room here will be aware of the Egyptian activist who made the news when he was freed from jail so quickly because of his adept use of Twitter and his passionate followers. I could go on and on about examples in the Middle East and around the world. My point is really that it's become accepted that modern conflict is a struggle for influence on public opinion in addition to territory and sovereign power. And so new online activity captures the imagination and headlines every day. And yet, we still know surprisingly little about why some of this activity turns into political movements for peace or action on the ground, and why the vast majority of others don't. In the case of almost all those incidents that I just listed over the course of the last couple of years, the blogs, the Twitters, and of course the Facebook protests, in every case, when we speak with the organizers after the fact in our research, we invariably hear, we really didn't expect it to work like that. We really didn't expect it to be so successful, and we really don't know why it was so successful. We've tried other similar things before and haven't been nearly as successful. And success, by the way, is usually some magical connection of one online community with another online community, which then connects with the offline community and ultimately traditional media. Which brings me to today's meeting. This is the second meeting we've held in our Blogs and Bullets initiative here at the Institute, where we're working with partners like the Berkman Center at Harvard in an ongoing effort to try to understand the power of online discourse for conflict resolution as well as for conflict promotion. In fact, one of the reasons for today's meeting is to help us to know where to go from here in our research at USIP as well as at Berkman. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you blog out there? How many of you read blogs? Just about. So we have a room full of experts on this subject. Great. So let me ask all of you experts to please lean in today. Ask these really smart guys from Cambridge, Massachusetts, some tough questions when we open the floor for questions. Seize the day. We really want your guidance on where our research should be going. The good news is, I'm confident that by the time everybody leaves this room, we'll all be a bit wiser, thanks to this distinguished group here. And I'll introduce them all in a few minutes, but let me just quickly set the stage. Following the introductions, our partners from the Berkman Center at Harvard are going to take us through their extraordinary research and give us an overview of the most interesting findings after looking at about 35,000 blogs from 18 countries. Our other three panelists, the other end of the table there, will then respond, after which we'll try to put a face, or a couple of faces actually, to this term blogger by showing some clips of interviews that we did over video Skype last week with some bloggers in the Middle East. And finally, we'll open up the floor for your questions as well as for questions from our online audience. Since this is an event about online discourse in the Arab world, we thought it would be a novel idea to actually open up the event to online discourse in the region, and indeed throughout the world. And we have, we expect to have actually people online from somewhere between 10 and 20 countries, if experiences taught us anything. So we're broadcasting in the back there, a live video stream. Turn around, say hello to your mom, who's back there. We're broadcasting a live video stream of the entire event at www.usip.org/ArabBlogs. Also, if you're online or even in this room and plan to post on Twitter, the official hashtag is #ArabBlogs. We also didn't want folks in the room here to miss out on the online discussion, so periodically I'm going to call on my colleague here, Joel Whitaker, who's sitting at that table, who will be moderating the online discussion throughout today to summarize what he's hearing online and pass on questions from the online participants to our panelists. So expect to get some questions from folks who aren't here physically. So if you are out there watching online, in your pajamas perhaps, please lean in as well and send us your questions. Final piece of housekeeping, let me ask everybody here to please take out their cell phones now and set them on stun mode if you haven't already remembered to do so. All right, let me introduce our three blogatologists here. And yes, I did just make up that term, but I think it is an apropos term since all three of these fellows have spent as much time studying the internet as any ologist in any field I know. First, we'll hear from John Palfrey and Bruce Ettling. John is a faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, where his research and teaching focus on internet law, intellectual property, and the potential of new technologies to strengthen democracies around the world. He's also on the faculty of Harvard Law School and has written extensively about the digital world, including co-authoring a book titled Access Denied, which is, in my view, a must-read if you want to understand internet censorship around the world. Bruce Ettling, 2 seats down there, directs the Internet and Democracy Project at the Berkman Center. And before joining Berkman, Bruce was the director of USAID's Office of Democracy and Governance in Kabul, Afghanistan. And he's also worked on democracy programs for USAID in Russia and Cambodia. In addition to working on the Iranian, Arabic, and Russian blogospheres, he studies online organizing and blogs himself at the Internet and Democracy blog. And our third member in the middle there of the triumvirate is John Kelly, who's both an affiliate of the Berkman Center and the founder and the lead scientist of Morningside Analytics, a company dedicated to taking our understanding of online discourse to a new level through some really fascinating techniques that he's going to talk about today. As the Morningside webpage tells us, we take you far beyond hits or page views, uncovering who is listening to whom, why they are interested, and how ideas move among and between different audiences. Okay, I'm hooked, John. And with that, let me again remind everybody, please jot down your questions for when we're going to open the floor later on. But most importantly, please join me in welcoming our first three panelists here, John, Bruce, and John.
Sheldon, thank you so much. This is a great honor to be able to release this research here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I don't think I've ever been at quite such a cool networked event where you even have already got the hashtag namespace dominated for Arab blogs. This is fabulous. Well done. And thank you to everyone who is joining from afar and to all of you who have come out this morning to talk about this research. Thank you also to the United States Department of State, which has funded the bulk of this research, and to the many partners who have participated in this effort. For 2 minutes, I want to just give the theoretical frame for why we're doing this, and then turn it over to my colleagues for the interesting and surprising results of this study. The Internet and Democracy Project at the Berkman Center was formed to bring data to the kinds of questions that Sheldon so beautifully outlined, really to say, can we inform through empirical analysis whether or not the use of the Internet is in fact having any impact on the way that politics are practiced around the world, and whether or not it is helping or hindering the spread of democracy. And there are a bunch of questions I think that we can answer along the road to that as we bust a bunch of myths, and we'll learn from some of our colleagues whether we're busting the right myths in the process here or not. One is really looking at the emergence of new public discourses, new public conversations. So why are we asking questions about the blogosphere? The blogosphere, of course, is only one indication of what's being discussed in the Arabic language conversation, much as it was in the Farsi conversation we've studied and otherwise. But it's a very important one. It's an important one because it's so exposed to the rest of the world. It's something that brings chatter that used to be around dinner tables and around water coolers into a public domain. And it allows us to have a window into public discourse that we hadn't been able to see before. Second, it allows us to look into what it means for this discourse, in fact, to be networked and to exist in a public sphere of the sort that we're looking at. One of the most important things that we find, of course, is that it reinforces what is being discussed more broadly. The technology itself doesn't drive any action. The technology is a means to an end. It allows people to organize very effectively as groups. It allows people to take messages that were otherwise uncovered and bring them to the surface, often then feeding them to the mainstream media and back and forth using a variety of tools. And we'll see the extraordinary influence of things like YouTube as well as Twitter and other social network tools in this story. And last, it also gives us an insight into a battle that's going on. It really is a battle, I think, between individuals and organizations that are seeking to use these technologies to advance public discourse, to advance autonomy and so forth, and many states that are seeking to crack down on that discourse. We know about the rise of Internet censorship, the rise of Internet surveillance, and I think it's very important that we understand the emergence of this blogosphere and how it in fact functions at the same time as we look at the various crackdowns, much in the news, of course, today with Iran, but similarly an extraordinary story in China and Uzbekistan and many parts of the Middle East and North Africa. So it's against this backdrop of an ongoing conflict story as between individuals and groups and states to control this new public discourse as it emerges. So with that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, John Kelly, so you get the extraordinary story that he's uncovered.
Thank you. Hi, folks. So this is the good for you slide, which I'm going to spend as little time on as possible.
We need the spinach.
But we need some spinach, yep. So we're interested in the blogosphere as an online public. So a lot more conversation happens in private sphere technology spaces like Facebook, things like that, social network services. What we're interested in are the things that link across society that are publicly visible, that carry on the kind of discourse which ends up in a feedback loop with the mainstream media and other sources of elite power. So it's the part of the internet conversation that, even though it's small, has disproportionate influence in public affairs, we believe. So we started with by selecting Arabic language websites, Arabic language blogs that we discovered by crawling the web that were mostly in Arabic. And then we excluded things that were more social network service like Facebook, Spaces Live, MySpace, things like that, to find this public discourse. And then we only selected those things that were actually linked to some significant degree. And we wound up with about 35,000 Arabic language blogs that fit that description. And as soon as we started working with it, we discovered that a lot of Arab bloggers blog in combinations of Arabic and English, combinations of Arabic and French, even the three languages and others too. So we had to expand to bring in a lot of these multilingual bloggers and bloggers that are blogging across the linguistic border. So we brought in other stuff too. And then we are interested in the network structure, the biggest things going on. What is really the structure of this network? So we selected the most connected of those. And we did a bunch of different stuff that we'll look at soon to cluster that up, visualize it. On top of that, then we harvested all the text from these blogs, and we did some textual analysis with the computer and with human beings going and reading 4,000 of these blogs. We had 10 researchers go and read. So a pretty massive effort. And now for the more fun stuff. So this is where we start from. These are social network diagrams of 12 different international blogospheres. So each one of these represents the blogosphere around a language. And the main thing to see here is that they all look different. And they look different because these networks are formed by bloggers linking to one another and linking to other things. And they do that because of what they're interested in, by and large. So bloggers that are interested in the same stuff will pull together into these neighborhoods. And we can see how they are different from society to society in ways that are very important. Here are just what these are. Kind of interesting to take a look at the variety of forms and languages. So Arabic, this is what you see when you go and first do the mapping of Arabic. This is a social network diagram using a physics model algorithm. What's going on here, simply, is every dot here represents a blog. The size of the dot is how many other blogs link to it, a measure of its importance. And its position is calculated in the following way. Imagine that there's a wind trying to blow all of these dots off the screen, and every blog that's connected to another by linking is pulled together as though by a spring or a force of gravity. What happens then is that all the people linked pull together into these network neighborhoods of densely interconnected bloggers, where information flows and where conversations happen. And the structure of that network reflects the interests of these bloggers, what it is that brings them together. So this is what it looks like in the Arab world, the Arabic blogosphere. We then add another kind of analysis on top of that. We want to divide this network into meaningful groups, and we do that by a process called attentive cluster analysis. So we're tracking what the bloggers are linking to every day over a long period of time. And over time, bloggers pay attention to similar resources as other bloggers interested in the same thing. And that's what we're seeing here. So we've done a statistical clustering that ends up separating the bloggers into groups of bloggers that link to the same kinds of stuff. In the US, that might be Daily Kos and other liberal websites for liberal political group. And on the conservative side, there'd be other websites and sports bloggers, et cetera. So bloggers link to stuff that they find interesting in common. And that's what we see with the colors on the map here. So blogs that are the same color, linking to similar kinds of stuff, represents similar interests among the bloggers. So we went into this project without any really clear idea of what we would find here. We had some guesses, and along the way we found some surprises. I just want to quickly show you, however, that that 2D map is kind of a poor approximation of what we really look at when we are doing this analysis. So this is a three-dimensional map of the Arabic language blogosphere, and in it what you can see are the network relationships really coming into form. And we see these very large clusterings around certain things. And what we found is the largest clusters are really around nations. If you look at the big structure that's coming around now to the front, that's the Egyptian blogosphere, which is by far the largest cluster in the Arabic blogosphere. So what's going on here? We get this far with just the computer, just running the algorithms and figuring out what people are linking to, and we have to do a lot of work then to figure out what this means. We've done some of that work, and what we see in the Arabic language blogosphere, Arabic blogosphere, is a lot of different clusters around different things, but mainly around nations. So we see the Egyptian, big Egyptian cluster there. There are different kinds of Egyptian bloggers, secular reformists on one end of that structure, Muslim Brotherhood on the other. We see bloggers from Lebanon and Jordan in with this area called the English Bridge, which we'll talk about a lot today. English Bridge connects up with the American blogosphere, the international blogosphere. A lot of those bloggers are blogging predominantly in English or combinations of English and Arabic, as are the other bloggers, the bloggers in Lebanon, Jordan, some of those other areas. We have another big cluster around Saudi Arabia and big cluster around Kuwait. The big picture here is that on one side, we see bloggers with a more Western orientation that are more linked into American blogs, more linked into the international blogosphere. And on the other side of the map, we see the blogs that are on the far away from that, and they have more of a religious orientation. We'll see that in greater detail. There are some really important major zones here to understand. This area we call Levant English Bridge. It's mostly Levantine bloggers, so Palestinians, Jordanians, Lebanese, blogging in combinations of Arabic and English, as well as a lot of other bloggers from different countries, Egypt, any of the other countries, who are blogging in English, primarily connecting with a Western audience. And that's the zone we call the English Bridge. That English Bridge is where this blogosphere hooks into our own. And that has important implications, as we'll see later. We find a similar thing with Maghrebi, North African bloggers, and a French bridge. So there are a lot of them that are blogging in combinations of French, linking into the French blogosphere. Smaller than the English, however. Egyptian blogosphere, by far the biggest thing, the biggest single thing going on here. And very interestingly, we see the same kinds of internal divisions, articulation that we see, say, in the American blogosphere or the Persian blogosphere, where we can see bloggers with one political attitude on one side and another on the other side. Then we have other national clusters, and there are only a few of them, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Kuwait, that really form their own distinctive blogospheres. And Kuwait, you may notice, is divided in two, actually, with about half of them blogging mainly in Arabic, the other half blogging in some English or all English as well. And then we've got this area, the Islam-focused area, which is fairly loosely connected, but pretty intensely focused on religious matters. And that's the last major zone. So Sheldon asked me to talk about this as what are the surprises here. So I thought I'd walk you through some of the results by talking about what really surprised us in this study. And we've got three stories here. So the first question we asked, the first surprise was, where's Iraq? You hear a lot about the Iraqi blogosphere. We expect it to be very important. I don't see an Iraqi cluster there. Where are the Iraqis? Well, one of the ways that we do this analysis, one of the things we're bringing to bear are a lot of metadata. So things that we can know about websites that we harvest by computers or by humans coding things up. So we're looking at some national tags here. So for instance, this is Berkman human coding data. Who of our coders told us was living in Kuwait? And we see, well, mostly where we would expect. Smaller countries are here. So Qatar bloggers are here, but they don't form a national cluster. They're embedded in other places. Dubai, Palestinian bloggers are mainly in that bridge area. These are bloggers that live in Beirut, mainly in the Lebanon area. Bahraini bloggers, Yemeni bloggers, it's a little dark, but you can see them all clustered down there. So every group you're going to find here somewhere. Tunisians up there, Moroccans there. So, but you don't always end up with a national cluster that is easily identifiable, a kind of sufficient center of gravity to pop out in the analysis. You do get that with Jordanians, and you see some that are blogging mainly in a Jordan-focused area, and others that are moving into that bridge that's connecting up with the West. So here are the Iraqis. They are more embedded in the bridge than any other national cluster. Figuratively, you could say that all the Iraqi bloggers are basically, in some sense, on the road to Washington. They are densely, they're in that part of the network that is most connected up with the international and American blogospheres. And there are a lot of questions that raises about how we're interacting with these. Another big surprise, from the human coding data, these are all the blogs that the coders told us were expatriates. So another interesting story here. If one way that the West connects with the Arabic world is through this bridge, another way is from Arab expatriates living in the West who are still blogging spread across all these national clusters. So it's yet another channel of international dialogue that was very interesting and unexpected, because we would have thought that they would be all up there in the bridge. Not the case. So, second story, the media ecosystem. Where do people get their news? Where's it coming from? What do these bloggers link to, and what does that tell us about their interests and the way that information flows in the Arab blogosphere? Let's take, we're going to take a look at another quick method. We break out our clusters one by one. So here we're looking at the Kuwaiti Arabic cluster. That's them there on the map. And we apply another kind of analysis we call cluster focus indexing, where we look at all the websites that they link to, and we're able to see the sites that this cluster pays the most attention to. The metrics, how we calculate that's a little bit boring, but trust me that the ones out there on the right are the ones that this cluster is really attentive to. And so we can see some examples. Enter Q8, Q8 61 seems to make sense. The other thing to notice is that they're all blogs here. So there's a Kuwaiti cluster, and there's everybody linking to enter Q8. So very localized audience, very focused in the nation. You'll notice there's some other bloggers who are linking to it, mostly larger bloggers from outside the region. Okay, let's take a look at another example, Muslim Brotherhood over here. This is the site, these are the sites that they link to with the greatest intensity, the most focus, and mostly in that same area, it's a Muslim Brotherhood blogger. So we see bloggers, some people say, well, do blogs form a means of pan-Arabic discourse? It's one of the kinds of things you hear people say. Actually, blogs on the whole are the most localized form of Arabic language discourse. So what's not? Well, here's Al Arabiya. Here's everybody who in the last year linked to Al Arabiya. This is something that has pan-Arab attention. Everybody will link to Al Arabiya. So blogs very concentrated, mainstream media not so much. Here's the Hezbollah press site. You see most of their linking is in Lebanon. You see a lot of the local press, newspapers, local media get linked to more by their national cluster, but then also some of the big bloggers who are out there sort of connecting the big space. Gives you a sense of how the big bloggers form a role holding this network together. Here's a Saudi paper, same thing, locally clustered, but some attention outside. Now here we're coming up on the surprise. So here's Al Jazeera, by far the biggest mainstream media source for bloggers spread across the map. And here's Arabic language Wikipedia. We didn't expect this, but the Web 2.0, Wikipedia got the same reach in the Arabic blogosphere as does Al Jazeera. And now look at YouTube. That's YouTube. That's this number two, number one. The number one website connecting Arabic bloggers is YouTube. And there's a really interesting story there, more of which you can read about in the paper. So we have to move on. I'm sure I'm running a little bit. I've got to get people to read it. It's 50 pages or 60, you know? Okay, so that's the second story. The surprise is the dominance of Web 2.0. The third story. Well, everybody's talking about America, right? This is the thing, you know, we wonder here in Washington, D.C. especially.
We hope.
We hope, yeah. Well, or maybe not, because, you know, I'll probably not spoiling any surprises by saying that dominantly when people evaluate, when they discuss America evaluatively, it's negative for the most part. But here are all the people that, bloggers that use the Arabic term for America in the past year. So is this a lot or a little? It looks like a lot. All over the map, people are talking about it. But here's the number that use the word corruption. The same basic spread, corruption, everybody talks about corruption. And here's everybody that talks about Palestine. More, significantly more, about 50% more. But that's just a number of bloggers who use that term. But is this, so the main message here is that there are some things that bloggers talk about across the entire Arab blogosphere. There are other things that they only talk about in certain chunks. So the Tomorrow Party, an Egyptian reform-oriented party, these are the bloggers that talk about it, only the Egyptians. Jassem al-Kharafi, Speaker of the Kuwaiti National Assembly, very popular for Kuwaitis to talk about. So there's a lot of discourse which is really nationally constituted. Only a few things get this kind of interest across the entire area. So how then do we better understand this phenomenon of what's talked about everywhere and what's only talked about in some places? So here's something we got from our human coding. So we asked them to code topics, which bloggers are talking about which kinds of things. So we see here who's talking about Western culture and values being critical, who's talking about Western cultural and values offering support, and who's talking about human rights. Don't even bother trying to read all the little stuff, but let me tell you that the Bridge and the Levant areas, in other words, the parts of the blogosphere that are most connected with our own, and most likely to blog in English are on the left. So we can see that Western culture and values, whether supporting or criticizing, is something that happens much more in the part of the blogosphere that actually crosses our own. It's where the two come together, where you know, our issue of, oh, what do they think about Western cultural values is the thing that people talk about. The further you move from that bridge area into national clusters, the less that's important to anybody. However, talking about human rights, civil rights, political rights continues to be an extremely important topic. Here's another look at it. So who criticizes domestic political leaders? Mostly when Arabic bloggers blog about domestic political leaders, it is critical. And who supports the Palestinians and who criticizes the United States? Well, again, we see that most of that discourse, we see domestic political leaders are criticized across the map. The United States, criticism happens more in this bridge crossover area than it does in other places. It is still significant in other places. However, it is far less important everywhere than criticism of domestic political leaders. Much less important, and more or less important the further you move away from the part of the blogosphere that crosses with our own. And support for Palestine is very high. It's a unifying issue, and yet it is still less, almost across the board, than criticism of domestic political leaders. So terrorism and political Islam, the third part here. So we found almost no overt support for terrorism. You know, pictures of Osama bin Laden and Go Jihad. You know, that sort of thing was extraordinarily rare. Extraordinarily rare. We found a lot of criticism of terrorism, of political violence, more in this bridge crossover area, you know, where than we did elsewhere, but it was still pretty high everywhere. And much more important than criticism of the United States. And also, criticism of political Islam was also a fairly major thing and happened more than, actually, in most places, criticism of the United States. There are exceptions to everything, but these are the major trends. The stuff that we care about is mostly a discourse that happens in the part of that network which crosses with our own. The further you move away from it, the more it is really local matters that dominate, local politics, and these kind of core values issues that are important to other folks that are also important to us. That discourse doesn't appear to necessarily involve us in a lot of cases. So what about a shorter, almost out, okay. In the last 2 weeks, I'm almost done. Corruption, who's talked about corruption in just the last 2 weeks, 2 weeks from yesterday? Big. Who's talked about Egypt? Bigger. Who's talked about America? Much less. But now, who has talked about Barack Obama? A lot more. Well, he just gave a speech over there, so you might expect this. And he has been one of the most talked about entities that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. And where is that discourse concentrated? A huge amount of it is in the Muslim Brotherhood and religious religious Egyptian bloggers. They are really lit up with talking about Obama. And it'd be nice to know what they're saying, right? Well, I can tell you what their most, what their favorite YouTube video is, the one that those bloggers are citing the most, and it is a clip of Obama giving a speech to AIPAC with Arabic subtitles, and I don't know what they say because we just looked at this yesterday.
AIPAC
but,
being the American-Israeli
American-Israeli Political Action Committee, yeah. So anyway, just to recap the surprises, Iraq is enmeshed in a bridging region to English, close to the U.S. and the English blogosphere. Most of the topics of concern to the West live more in this bridge than they do elsewhere. Web 2.0 platforms have the largest reach and are incredibly important across the Arabic blogosphere. Most blogs are very targeted, whereas mainstream media go from very local focus to pan-Arabic. Web 2.0 dominate. And the U.S. is not a dominant topic of political conversation. It's a broad one, but domestic issues, terrorism, internal cultural struggle are more important than talking about the United States. And the United States is more discussed in this bridge region than elsewhere, whereas the values of concern that we share spread across the map. And
Thank you, John.
So thank you, John. I'm sure you all have a ton of questions for him. Just one clarifying comment that some folks may not understand. Human coding just means having Arabic. We had a team of Arabic speakers from a number of countries across the region, including Egypt and Iraq, Kuwait, and others, who read and filled out a common questionnaire based on, and then we take all that data and sort it at the end. So that's what he meant by human coding, just in case that was one of probably the many things that wasn't clear in terms of the methodology, which is hard to understand. I just wanted to take a crack at coming up with a few implications for conflict prevention and conflict studies, and I actually think probably the folks in the room and the folks online will have probably better ideas, because I'm not an expert in conflict, but since we're here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, wanted to think through a few ideas. The first one just wanted to hit a few results of what we found and reinforce how that's important. In particular, we really were surprised in a sense that there was no cluster around extremism or jihad, or violent jihad. Going into it, I think probably because we've adopted sort of some mainstream media frames, we thought, okay, we're going to see YouTube videos of American soldiers getting blown up. Really, there was no consistent, large link-to cluster around that. So we think that's a positively potential finding. As I'll discuss later, we really need to dig into it more, because terrorism and extremism can mean so many different things to different people across the region. I just want to reinforce that, so we didn't look for those types of groups, but we did find that we sort of suspect that they're in these private, what we're calling private publics in the paper, these walled-off gardens of password-protected chat rooms. But the key point is that they're not part of the dominant public discussion in what we call the networked public sphere. We also, as John showed, we did some automated term extraction, and we also, again, we took in so we had this early finding, and then we went in and said, okay, well, let's see where it is discussed, and we took, with some experts from the region, a list of 50 or so extremist groups and people, and fed them into the computer and said, okay, where are they discussed, relative, who discusses them the most relative to other clusters, and we actually found that they were very rarely discussed in any of the major clusters that we found. To the extent that they were, it was mostly in the Maghreb and in the Islam region. Is that correct, John?
The Arabic Maghreb.
The Arabic
French,
Maghreb,
yeah.
Thank you. Again, as John just mentioned, so we're in the U.S. and we come in this probably with the frame of, so what do they think about us? As we mentioned, in the two major conflicts that the U.S. is involved in that part of the world, Iraq was very rarely, not very rarely, but was rarely discussed. It was not a major topic of discussion. As Sheldon mentioned, I was in Kabul before, so I was interested how much did they talk about Afghanistan? Well, almost not at all. We found literally just a handful of blogs that talked about the conflict in Afghanistan. And again, so the one unifying thing that John hit us several times was that Palestine, the conflict between Israel and Palestine, is really the thing that, and especially because this happened over the conflict in Gaza last year, that this really is the one issue that unifies the entire blogosphere. And so, not that any of us needed another reason to resolve this conflict, but there's another one right there. Going forward with, we want to talk briefly about the bridge bloggers, because we think with conflict studies and sort of riffing off the contact theory that the more the two groups that are in conflict are in touch with each other and get to know each other and understand each other, the less likely conflict will be. And so a question going forward perhaps is this true virtually as well? That if we get to know each other just online, does that also lead to less conflict? And that would be an interesting question going forward. We think in that bridge bloggers, this group that we've identified in the middle of the map, is really important for this, because these folks are blogging English, foreign American, and English-speaking audience, and they are interpreting what bloggers in the region are saying and how they're thinking, and helping us understand their politics and their culture and their views on conflicts. So they're helping us get beyond these sort of cartoonish, simple sort of existing frames that we probably come into when we're looking at these conflicts. We'd offer a couple ideas, though, just sort of a couple cautions on bridge bloggers. Like any content on the web, we need to understand who these bridge bloggers are and maybe some biases they might have and sort of their independence. That sort of goes with anything, obviously, on the web. And also, because when the mainstream media and probably folks like us at Harvard and our research pick up and sort of amplify the voice of a specific bridge blogger, that can have negative consequences in the sense that it can raise their profile within their country and bring on more problems for them with local state repression. A last quick point is to resist mirror blogging, because which Mark Lynch calls mirror blogging, which is the opposite of bridge blogging, and that's going and finding someone who thinks exactly like you do and considering that as the sort of authentic view of what folks in the region are thinking. And so obviously we should push back against that. A couple future questions for research. In addition to the ones I already mentioned on the contact theory, we'd really be interested in digging more into extremist views. One way to do this might be to work with those who've already sort of tracked these types of websites and blogs that are constantly moving and being shut down, and sort of do some text scraping analysis and deep sort of textual analysis to understand the types of words they use and the types of ways that they frame their discussions. And potentially even if this is like an early warning system. One of those is do they sort of adopt the mainstream media views? Or are they really an alternative media, and are they talking about the conflict situations on the other side in these conflicts in different ways? Sort of also building off of Donald Ellis's, who studies media and conflict, which is probably as close as the internet and conflict has gotten. There isn't a lot of research out there on it, but he sort of argues that using dehumanizing language about the other side and racial slurs, et cetera, allows folks within a conflict to more easily lead to violence because you see them as less than human. So it'd be interesting to sort of, again, do more deeper textual analysis and see, are people really talking about the other side as sort of equal partners for a possible peace process, or is it really just as, you know, they're referred to as cockroaches or something that's less than human? So fortunately, we think, at least as initial finding, that in the Arabic world, or the Arabic blogosphere that we looked at, that this really isn't the case, that there was not a great deal of this, but we didn't look at it specifically. This is opposed to sort of our really early exploratory research in the Russian language blogosphere during the Georgian conflict between Russia and Georgia, where really the Russian language bloggers adopted very sort of negative, dehumanizing frames. So that's an interesting other area for research, and I'll leave it up to the experts for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, partners from Berkman Center. Excellent. Very, very impressive, gentlemen. And I know I saw lots and lots of scribbling going on during your presentation. I know there are lots and lots of questions out there, and we're going to get to all of them. We've got a good chunk of time set aside just for questions. Two things, though. First, Bruce referenced the personal risk that some bloggers experience by doing this. And in fact, I said about a half an hour ago that we were going to be showing a video of some bloggers that we had taped over video Skype last week to try to put some faces to this amorphous, abstract term of bloggers. I just got a text message of somebody who's feeling personally at risk, in danger by doing that. So we're going to scrap that. It was only a 5-minute clip of a couple of bloggers, but because it's all seamlessly woven together, we're not going to show the clip at all and honor their desire to be anonymous. Also want to tell folks, outside there is on the table, if you didn't see it coming in, there's a summary of the research findings from this group. So before I get to your questions, though, I want to go to our three distinguished respondents here who really bring three very different perspectives to the table here. Saad Ibrahim, I'm going to introduce all three and then we'll speak with each one individually. Saad Ibrahim is really a hero to a lot of people, especially in the Middle East. He's been a champion of democracy and human rights in Egypt for many decades, arrested and imprisoned on multiple occasions for his courage and outspokenness. And today he lives in the U.S., effectively in exile for his work in Egypt. But his work and sacrifice has earned him many awards, including the Ratieux Democracy Lecture Prize at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars and an esteemed fellowship at Harvard University in Cambridge. So he knows these fellows as well. Daniel Brumberg, I'm proud to say, is my colleague here at the U.S. Institute of Peace and acting director of USIP's Muslim World Initiative in the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. He's also an associate professor at Georgetown University and a regular blogger himself for the Washington Post Online. And if you really want to read a great post about the Iranian elections, you should check out what he wrote this week, titled Death of the Islamic Republic in 5 Acts. And finally, Raid Jarrar is an Iraqi-born architect and political analyst who moved to the U.S. a couple of years ago. He was the country director of the only door-to-door casualties survey in Iraq in 2003, and then established a local Iraqi grassroots organization that carried out hundreds of reconstruction projects in 10 Iraqi cities. Jarrar is currently the Iraq consultant for the American Friends Service Committee, and he's been blogging about the situation in Iraq since 2002 on his blog, Raid in the Middle. But I have to actually also say that for all his hard work, Raid's main claim to fame was in 2006, while on a JetBlue flight from New York to Oakland, and he was wearing an anti-war T-shirt that read, "We will not be silent," and it was in both Arabic and English, and he was asked to cover up the T-shirt by TSA authorities, forced to sit at the back of the flight since he made other travelers uncomfortable. But Raid took them to court, and as you might have read recently, won his case. So, again, let me ask everybody to welcome all of our discussants here, who, as I say, bring 3 very different perspectives to this topic. Saad, let me start with you, if I might, because I think it's appropriate because we just saw the largest cluster of blogs by far was from your home country, from Egypt. And the report, anybody who's read the report saw that there are a lot of interesting things to say about the Egyptian blogosphere, both about the size and the makeup of folks who are blogging in Egypt, as well as, and this is what I'd like to ask you about, as well as the apparent decision by the Egyptian government to tolerate online what is a banned organization offline, the Muslim Brotherhood. Let me ask you, how should we interpret the government's willingness, it seems, to bend the rules for the group online to the point where even 78% of the self-identified Muslim Brotherhood bloggers actually are blogging under their own name, which is the largest cluster of any self-identified bloggers in their study. Can you help us understand that?
Well, thank you very much, Sheldon. And I must start by admitting how ignorant I am about the subject. I read the report, and I nearly declined because it was almost written in Latin for me. And then I was chatting with one of my associates in Egypt, a 27 years old blogger, and I told her how lost I am reading the report. She asked me to send it to her, and I did. And she walked with me through it, almost like, you know, a baby steps, until I got some sense out of it. And until this morning, she was in contact through email, explaining and telling me what to say and not to say, and warning me about certain things. And her name is Delia Ziada, a remarkable young lady, about 26 years old, and an activist in her own right. So anyhow, whatever I'm going to say has to be taken with a lot of grains of salt. My first observation has to do with the group that is doing this in the Arab world, and especially in Egypt. They are nearly all young people, under 30, and that is not to belittle or to underestimate them, because as a constituency, they make up 60% of the population. The second thing that I wanted to say, that for so long they were kind of accused of being self-centered or country-centered. In the last week, they nearly put themselves at the service of their Iranian colleagues, which surprised everybody and is making the Egyptian authorities very nervous. That the Egyptian bloggers now are giving a hand, since the Iranian authorities shut down the internet in Iran, and through proxy and bridging, the Egyptians and the Arab bloggers are now almost 24 hours working for Iran, to be the voice of Iran in the absence of director. My third point has to do with the Egyptian authorities' attitude toward blogging and also toward the Muslim Brothers. Since 2007, the Egyptian authorities has nearly declared war on all the bloggers in Egypt, had put many of them in prison, had tortured many of them, and again, using their own blogging techniques, they got their story, even from within prison, known everywhere. And that was a big scandal, and it helped to mobilize a lot of public opinion. And we're discovering that bloggers is almost like a tribe worldwide. They really, not only do the Egyptian and the Arab bloggers now put themselves in the service of their Iranian colleagues who are rebelling in the streets of Iran, but we also discovered that the whole worldwide bloggers come to each other's help. So whenever Egyptian bloggers got into trouble, and you probably all now learned the name of Karim Amir, who was, of course, tortured, imprisoned, and so on. Everybody knew about him. And that is, again, thanks to this tribalism among the bloggers worldwide, which is to welcome. I know tribalism is sometimes frowned upon, but in this case, I think it is very benign tribalism. My last point then has to do with the Egyptian authorities' attitude toward the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers, as the report aptly pointed out, are very active blogging. And they are always 1 or 2 steps ahead of their non-Muslim brother colleagues, and definitely about 10 steps ahead of the Egyptian authorities. In other words, whatever appears in public is not because the Egyptian authority is tolerant. It is because the Egyptian authority is inept. That is, to put it bluntly, because I asked the same question to my young coach in Egypt, and said it's just ineptness, it is not tolerance, and because I noted that in the report. And she said, well, you know, the Muslim Brothers were the first to use it because that's the only outlet for them. And she said, this applies to other disenfranchised groups in Egypt and the Arab world. So the Baha'is, for example, as a religious group, very tiny religious group, but their use of blogging is very disproportionate because that's the only outlet for them to get their voice heard. Increasingly, women are getting in. It used to be male-dominated, but increasingly, Saudi women are using blogging, again, to, we call it electronic unveiling. So even though the Saudi women are veiled from head to toe, but now through blogging and electronic media, they are unveiling, they are exposing, they are talking, they are getting their voices heard, and that is a very welcome, again, side. Finally, I think what we are really facing, what we are seeing, is a new politics in a new age in the region. Politics is not dominated by ideologies, but dominated by issues and by technology. And I think that is probably welcomed, and that explains why bashing America in blogs is not a pastime as it is in the written media, which belongs to the last generation, to the last century, my generation. So in a way, even though you'd find a lot of criticism of America, but it's not a visceral, knee-reaction criticism, right and left. It is really issue and focused and so on. And I think this new politics is probably what's going to, in the medium and the long run, help democratize Arab world. And with that, I'd like to end my...
Excellent. Thank you very much, Saad. Despite that gracious introduction that you gave yourself of somebody who doesn't know, doesn't feel comfortable in the medium, it is clear, I think what comes through is, we wanted to hear from somebody who's been a lifelong activist for democracy and human rights in the region. And even though you are not a technophile, I hear a lot of excitement about the medium and its potential in what you've just said. Dan, let me turn to you and pick up on some of the things that Saad said, if I might. But from your perspective, as the director of our Muslim World Initiative at the Institute, as where you say on the website, the webpage for the program, it's about mobilizing moderates and marginalizing militants, as well as building bridges for the U.S. Muslim world divide. For one thing, you heard this analysis indicating that bloggers are overwhelmingly critical of violent extremists. Good news there. On the other hand, they also seem to be overwhelmingly critical of the United States. Could you give us your perspective here?
First, yes, thanks very much. And I want to say, first of all, that I'm delighted to be with Saad. We have been friends and colleagues, and I was your student in 1980-something. I won't get too specific, but it's been nearly a quarter of a century or something like that, Saad. So it's a very special opportunity for me to be with my teacher and colleague. A few quick points. First of all, I found the report extremely interesting. I want to know a lot more about the bloggers. We know something about the bloggers, but the demographics, the economic and social roots of the bloggers is really important. I think we have to recognize that there's a lot of self-selection involved in who's a blogger and what their ideologies are and what their social backgrounds are. I know this anecdotally. My guess is that the more quantitative work would show this. And from my perspective, at least, I think that more background on the bloggers would suggest that some of the results which seem so surprising are perhaps not quite as surprising as might be suggested. Certainly I wasn't surprised by many of the results. Doesn't mean that they're not important. I mean, if the measures always has got to be a surprise to be important, that may be erroneous. But I think that we have to know a lot more, because a blogger is somebody who's probably from a certain kind of background, has certain kinds of views. The jihadists are not openly blocking. They put up the walls. They don't want the fact that we don't have information about them is really important. It's very significant. It does not suggest a lack of influence among themselves. It may be quite the reverse. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to be very careful. In terms of implications for Muslim-U.S. relations, I want to just add one point that Sheldon made. Yes, we're interested in our project on the U.S. Muslim world sort of issue, but increasingly in the last 3 years, we've really been focusing on internal conflicts in Muslim world countries, particularly in the Middle East, and the issues of political reform and democracy, which Saad and others around here know so well. And I want to comment very briefly on those two dimensions. First of all, it's refreshing to know and to find out, again, not terribly surprising in that regard, that there's a focus on local issues, local politics, that what people are mobilizing about are local issues. If you look at the history of, for example, the universities in the Middle East, you'll find out that the fences that were put up, or the walls that were put up between the universities and the street, were actually put up by authoritarian regimes, because what authoritarian regimes wanted to do, and this is the history of Tehran University where I've been, is make sure that the student can protest within the university but not outside. And the authoritarian strategy is to cut off these communities and let them talk to themselves. But as Saad well knows, at Cairo University, as soon as you go outside the gates, the regime gets really worried, because it can start linking up with other groups. And the threat of the internet is the creation of these linkages across these barriers. And as soon as they emerge, the regimes get really nervous. At the same time, it has to be said that from the perspective of the regimes, as long as these internet communities are talking to one another, to some extent, that saps some of their, potentially could sap some of their political influence. It could work both ways. And I think your report in the conclusion alludes to that point. It's not clear where the line of influence goes, because if they're talking to one another, if they're clustering, and you show the clusters, the secular cluster, the Islamist cluster, if they're clustering in that way, and there's not enough of this bridging, and the bridging is very important in that regard, to some extent that may play into the hands of authoritarian regimes, whether they're inept and or somewhat tolerant. As soon, of course, as they cross the red line and these groups are beginning to talk one another, then they get really nervous. And that's when they start shutting down this technology. So it can work different ways, and I think we have to keep track of that and be very careful about what the blogging interests are, because you do have. Saad is correct. There's a decline of ideology, but the ideology is still reflected in the data results. You have secularists talking to secularists, Islamists talking to Islamists. Your report says at the last page, facilitating cooperation between secular and Islamist reformers in Egypt. This is a major issue that we're interested in at the Muslim World Initiative, how to get these two groups talking to one another. And Saad, you've been very interested in these issues. My sense reading the data is that there's a lot of work to be done on getting and using the blog as a bridge building mechanism for conflict resolution in that particular regard. As far as the U.S. Muslim world dimension is concerned, and as I was alluding to before, the focus on internal issues is important, but yes, the issue of the United States looms large, and what looms very large is the Palestine conflict. And I think that is a point that cannot be emphasized strongly enough. This issue, the closer you get to the conflict geographically, but if you go to Indonesia, you'll notice that it's thriving in Indonesia, in Jakarta. This conflict has tended to sap the political energy out of a lot of these movements, complicated the effort to build bridges across the Islamist secular divide, because what happens is everybody can agree on opposing Palestine, on the slogans of opposition to Israel, but that obscures the harder work of actual political reform on the local level. And the question, therefore, is what is the impact of the blogosphere? Well, it tends to emphasize and perhaps magnify this issue, as it should. People feel strongly about it. I'm not faulting them for feeling strongly, but it would suggest that a resolution of this issue would be very helpful indeed for the capacity of these groups to begin to sort of focus even more intensively on the hard work of political reform at home. So I think that's a very important point. But overall, the trend, again, is very self-selected. We know the background. These are mostly middle class, professional students, universities for the most part. The trend is nevertheless, however self-selected, the trend is encouraging. The authoritarian regimes may be inept, but they also learn quickly. They get together and share information. They learn how to block these sites. They learn how to, and so keeping one step ahead of them is a challenge. But as long as we don't have a dynamic whereby the blog becomes a sphere for linking more of these groups together, it's possible, too, that a lot of the political energy can be dissipated in the blogosphere as opposed to mobilized on the street. I'll leave it there.
Very good points. And I'm sure folks will have questions about that, Dan, but I want to make sure we've got enough time for you all, John, Bruce, to respond a bit to some of the points that are being posed. And also, Dan, you raised the point about the demographics of the bloggers themselves. And I think in Raid, we actually have gotten about as close to the right demographic as possible. So, Raid, I hope you'll be able to give us a little bit of insight there. You've been blogging about the situation in Iraq since 2002. And continued blogging ever since you moved to the U.S. in 2005. So perhaps let's go straight to John's first surprise point, which was, where are the Iraqi bloggers here? It did not seem from the research there that it was a particularly dynamic blogosphere in Iraq. Is that simply a reflection of poor internet access, limited money to spend in internet cafes inside the country? What is your take on that? Help us understand this aha that John was pointing us to.
I think a lot of points can like a combination of a number of major points can lead to such a conclusion. Maybe one of them is the fact that the study focuses on 2008, not 2003, let's say, The time frame is different. Maybe if 2003, I think maybe the Iraq issue would have been a more vibrant issue for Arab speakers. 2008, Palestine was more important because what has been happening in Gaza. And of course, it's always an important issue. There are a lot of limitations in Iraq for bloggers. Some of them, as you mentioned, are infrastructure limitations. Last time I checked, Iraq was, I think, one of the least 5 countries in the world when it comes to the number of users per capita. There are around 2 users for every 1,000 Iraqis, compared to around 700 per every 1,000 in the US, or maybe 300 or 400 per every 1,000 in Iran. So you see, like the connectivity is very low to go with. The other indicator is that the other limitation is that Iraqis tend to express or participate online on non-governmental but group websites that maybe we can't call blogs. Most of the political parties and social parties have websites that I personally get most of my information from. I don't really get my information from the governmental newspaper. I get it from a lot of what's happening on the ground, videos and daily reporting, but it ends up on some political website. So these are excluded from the study for some technicality. So there are, I think, some limitations. The last thing that I think is worth mentioning here is the fact that there is a huge number of Iraqis, including myself, who blog in English. Not because we prefer English as a language or anything, but because Iraq is under a foreign occupation by a country that people mostly speak English. So more or less that is a domestic issue. I mean, speaking in English comes because of a domestic necessity, which is the foreign occupation of the U.S. And people try to reach out to a U.S. audience and let them know what's happening in their country. I have a couple of points, like just to end my comments with, about the framework of the study, because sometimes I feel that some studies, including this, is actually informative. There is a lot of work that has been done there, but the question is, who sets the parameters and the framework? Who says that there is such a thing in the Arab world or Muslim world as moderates versus militants? Isn't this something that we have assigned to the Arab world? Who says that there is such a thing as secular reformists versus religious brotherhood? Aren't these some of the things that we have assigned to the Arab world, not coming from there? So I mean, just the mere idea of us, going there and seeing if people support terrorism, and not finding that, like I have some questions about where is that coming from. So there are a lot of notions that are put there that are, number one, not defined. I don't get what terrorism means. It's not put in 2 quotes. I saw the word resistance, for example, put in 2 quotes, which I think the Arab world is way more familiar and understands the word resistance more than the word terrorism, which is a U.S. word that is imposed in the Arab world and Muslim world. These words are not defined. Moderate is not defined. Western values is not defined, It's not defined on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's not contested. It's not challenged. So I saw that a lot of these things, I think, if we have different parameters, this map will look differently. If we wanted to look at, for example, Egyptians, not based on their religion, whether they're religious or secular, but based on their political agendas or based on their class, I think the clustering will look different. So, I mean, our pre-notions, this is what I'm questioning here. Who decides the pre-notions? Who decides the parameters before we end up deciding, the details inside the parameters? In the case of Iraq, of course, I've been working against setting parameters in Iraq based on sectarian divisions. So from my point of view, it's not about proving whether Sunnis are more than Shiites or Shiites are more than Sunnis. From my point of view, it's not about Sunnis and Shiites. It's more about political divisions that are putting some Sunnis and Shiites against other Sunnis and Shiites. So the parameters that I will use will produce a complete different map than a parameter that the New York Times will put. So, I mean, I think that's an issue maybe to think about in the future when it comes to Iraq or other parts of the Arab and Muslim world.
Okay, opening that Pandora's box of the methodology here, and you guys got to respond to that. Let me, while I turn it over to the Berkman folks to talk about how they arrived at sort of their parameters and their terminology. Folks who have questions, there's a microphone there. You should come on up because I'm going to turn it open to the floor in just a moment to ask your questions. And John, over to you guys to respond to some of the points that have been raised.
So I guess, how long do I have to talk? we could stay here for another 3 or 4 days talking about it.
Exactly. And
that
to be
last
fair,
point only, yeah.
right, exactly. To be fair, we are asking these guys to kind of, you know, compress their description of the methodology in 10 minutes or less. But
well, the last point is a fantastic one. It's one we confront all the time, and let me at least dive into that and then try and hit some other things that I think were a common theme with what the other two panelists said. So one of the actually good things about this methodology is that at least until we put the labels on things, we're doing, I think, exactly what you suggest. We're going in and letting the categories emerge from the actual interaction. We don't go in with any kind of preconception. And in fact, we always run into trouble with people who say, well, where is this type of blogger or that type? And we actually, our methodological approach is from completely the other perspective. We say, let's look at the interaction, the discourse, and let's let the categories float up and emerge from that. So we get to the clustering based purely on mathematics. And I think where we run afoul of your very good criticism is when we try and put the labels on it. And that is the part that if we could get away with not putting labels on it, we would. I mean, each one of those labels that says something like secular reformist really ought to be a chapter of a book instead of just one label. And ultimately, these are not hard categories. So part of what we hope to do taking this research forward is actually work with experts who know something about the real categories. So it's not a couple of Americans, you know, sitting in Massachusetts figuring out what those are. We've run into this before, and we ran into it with Iran, so we do try to engage some folks with a little more perspective to help us modify the categories and at least make them not too ridiculous. But I completely agree with you that what you see that is so interesting, and we touch on this in the study, is the way in which when you read the actual descriptions of the bloggers, and because we had our research assistants go and read blogs and write little descriptions, 2-3 sentences about the blogger, is how poorly they fit into these categories and how complex they actually are. And that is one of the great things about looking at blogs. So I completely agree, the categories don't work, and we only use them because to some extent we have to put labels on things, and we hope to make that process a lot better. Another point I wanted to focus on is this idea of the tension between these spanning issues like Palestine and the local issues, local politics. So one of the things that one hears, and I think you touched on, is the way that a lot of times political energy or attention is diverted to an issue like that and away from local reform. And what we see, I think, with the blogosphere is that we've actually now got the establishment of a medium that allows more local focus to happen. So you have to compare it to, as opposed to what? So when we see a lot of local focusing happening in the blogosphere, that is probably more than has happened in a public way before. Now, that leads me to the third point, which I think runs through all of these comments, which is the critical distinction between what in the paper we call public publics, as represented by the blogosphere, and private publics. We admit that the blogosphere is a small part of the overall activity on the Arabic internet, and most of it is on these websites with chat rooms and bulletin boards. That is the dominant mode of discourse. There was a time in the United States where that was the dominant mode of discourse too, because those were the technologies that are out there. What has happened here and in some other places is that as blogging has come alive as a medium, what has happened is that people, some at least, have come out of those chat rooms into this public genre, and you end up with these blogospheres, very large linking structures that filter discourse, that allow people to connect, allow ideas to move around and to be persistent, hyperlinkable. They get picked up by the search engines. It's what drives Google search results. So a lot of other types of internet activity end up being driven by this link economy that's formed by blogs, whereas the stuff that happens in those private spaces is among the participants and has no life outside of that, except as happens through personal social interactions. Now, this is a critical point because that remains maybe the dominant place for this oppositional discourse in the Arab world, in part because they're throwing bloggers in jail, because this public medium is being shut down, and to the extent that it is allowed to thrive, and here's a policy implication, to the extent that freedom of speech is protected and it's allowed to thrive, this more public form of discourse, which is visible to everybody and can connect these different communities, can come into being, and people can get out of saying stuff in these private publics that are not allowable, and come say it somewhere where it is allowable, and those ideas can bounce off each other. And that structure, as we've seen in the United States, I mean, we know how the media industry here has been transformed by blogging in the last 5 years, and now all the newspapers are going out of business, not only because of that, but in part. That transformation is key because these publics, the blogosphere, ends up in a feedback loop with other elite media, in a way that what happens in the more hidden private publics does not. So reporters can read it, they can search for it, it ends up informing the larger mass-mediated public sphere and helps us move towards a new model of public discourse broadly that we're calling the networked public sphere in the paper.
Thanks. All right, I know we also have questions from folks online. Let me go over here, though. First questions of folks in the room.
First, I'd like to thank the panel and USIP for this excellent study and the discussion that's followed. My name's Andre Goodfriend. I'm going to be heading to Damascus in August as Consul General at our embassy there. And this whole subject fascinates me as far as how publics interact and how we interact with publics. There's been writing in the past few years about how transnational media have created a sort of global perspective, whether it's McWorld, or there's another book, McArabism, how things like Al Jazeera are creating a common Arab view that transcends national perspectives. Do you think that the internet and the blogosphere is running counter to that? As was noted in your study, YouTube is more popular than Al Jazeera, and similarly minded publics are talking with other similarly minded publics. So are people breaking away from this common perspective to reinforce a more narrow, locally focused perspective? That's one. And the second question is, this looks very much like a social attitudes survey in many ways, the textual analysis looking at what people are thinking. But again, it's a very skewed sample. So the question is, has there been any comparison? And well, first, social attitude surveys are very difficult in the Arab world, as I understand from Dr. Ibrahim. Has there been any comparison between similar studies in the West, where social attitude surveys are more possible to conduct, and how related the perspectives that come out of a study of the Western blogosphere match with Western social attitudes, so that type of comparison could perhaps be placed upon the Arab world as well? Thank you very much.
Okay, those seem to be about the study primarily. So why don't Bruce and John take a shot at that?
So quickly, I think that the research into how what online publics say corresponds to public opinion broadly is a new area that people are only now just trying to get funded and start doing. So that is really the cutting edge and critically important. We have no idea whether, and probably some of both is the answer, whether to what degree some of these attitudes represent the broader span of reflect broader public opinion, and to what extent some of these clusters represent minority opinion, which is thriving there because it's been shut off by other avenues. So it might be amplifying minority opinion in some cases and accurately reflecting the consensus view in other cases. So probably both of those things are going on, and the research you suggest is critical to figuring out how that happens. In terms of a biased sample, yes, and I think actually one of the key things to think about when looking at research like this is that the blogosphere or online media, normally people are trying to fit it into one of two mental frameworks. One is it's like a survey of the public, so it represents public opinion. The other frame is, no, it represents a publishing platform, a medium, so we look at it the way we judge newspapers or television. And the truth is, it's neither one of those two things. It combines elements of both. It is, by and large, blogs are an elite medium, because only the elite do it, but it's a wider elite than exists with the big megaphones of the mainstream media. So it is a new type of thing, and any sociologist or someone studying online stuff who tries to tell you that we've got it all figured out would be wrong. So we're only now trying to understand how publics are mediated, the public opinion among broad individuals interact online now with elite media institutions, and we're just figuring that out.
Let's take one more here before we go to the online folks. Yep.
Joseph Emmer from Freedom House. Thank you all for your comments already. I think it's very clear the sacrifices that many of the bloggers, and especially this part of the world, are making already, as Mr. Ibrahim noted. But I think it's also clear that there's a certain limitation to the online discourse. And the event that in our country at least comes to mind to me is the 2004 presidential election, when Howard Dean had amassed this really powerful online community and then ended up being a really colossal failure on the ground. It was not able to mobilize that community, that discourse online into actual action in real life. So my question for the researchers, I guess, is I don't know if you've looked at this, but to what degree, or maybe you could speculate, to what degree online life has led to real life? So to what point has the discussion online mobilized people into action? Has it communicated into at least more of a discussion on the ground and in people's immediate lives? And also, perhaps Mr. Ibrahim can comment on this, to what degree do you think there's a danger in the online discussion kind of leading to complacency almost? Is that discussion maybe distracting people from the really difficult grassroots in the real world work that has to occur for maybe change in human rights or democracy, any of these bigger ideas to actually take place?
Thank you. Well, that's a point that Dan raised as well, and it would be interesting to hear Saad and Raed comment on that, whether or not your sense, knowing the region as well as you do in Egypt, in Iraq, whether the online discourse actually might prevent people from taking to the streets an active way that could be counterproductive, if you will.
Who's the question for?
Sorry?
Who's the question
for? For Saad and for Raed, both of them. You actually posed the question, Dan, earlier, as something that you raised as a concern.
Let me take a crack at it, and I'd like to hear Raed's also. In Egypt, the security forces in the country are now close to 2 million human beings. Security, meaning riot police. And for those of you whose numbers may not mean much, let me tell you that the Egyptian army is only 300,000. So when you have the internal riot police being 2 million, you can get an idea of what the regime is really preparing for. It's not war with any neighbor, but it's war with the Egyptian people. And that's why for every demonstration or announcement about demonstration, you'd find for nearly every demonstration, there is 2 or 3 or 4 security people in the street, willing to arrest, willing to hit, to beat, to arrest, to detain, and so on. This kind of tight security situation has made